Hello watch lovers, welcome back to the channel. My name is Stian and today we have this beautiful old wrist alarm or Memovox from 1952, the first model from LeCoultre. You can see it's got this beautiful tuxedo dial, so black and silver. The alarm works. That's good news. See, the case is gold filled. That's kind of a pre-runner to a gold plating, but quite a lot thicker and better than gold plating. We see there is some wear on the watch, which should be expected for a 71-year-old watch. And I don't even feel that good, and I'm not even close to 71, so. On the time grapher we see it runs all right. The lines are fairly straight, low amplitude. And another issue is the positions of the watch. If we turn it around, we see that the rate is very, very different in different positions. We're going to have to address that also. So this watch has one of those kind of Russian casebacks, if you will, where the caseback itself is held in place by an outer ring, and that outer ring is what is screwed down. They did this on a few watches back in the day. And when I say it's kind of a Russian solution, the Russians did this much, much better. And also the French did it in some watches. But the way this ring is made, it's really susceptible to a lot of slipping and wear. So, but we do manage to get it off. And that shouldn't be so green, should it? It's this old gasket, apparently made from rubber at some point in time. We can see inside the caseback it says cased and timed in USA by LeCoultre. And that's an interesting thing. On the dial also, and also on the movement, it says LeCoultre and not Jaeger-LeCoultre. And this is of course one of the most mispronounced names in the watch world. And hey, I'm not in any way a stickler about mispronouncing names. I'm very used to my own name being mangled, and that doesn't really bother me. And I always get a lot of heat whenever I say Seiko instead of Seiko. Well, that's fine. The brand was founded by Antoine LeCoultre, or Antoine LeCoultre in French. And in the early 1900s, his company, called LeCoultre, of course, teamed up with a French watchmaker called Edmond Jaeger. In German it would be Edmond Jaeger. And the reason I'm saying that is that the name is obviously German. And he was from the Alsace region, or Elsass in German, which is kind of French, kind of German region in current France. Beautiful region. Cities like Strasbourg, Colmar and so forth. And in that region it's a big mix of French and German. So in Strasbourg, for instance, you have Chemin de Mittelhausbergen. Kind of fun, you know. Anyway, I took the balance off, and then before we proceed, let's just see how this watch works. When we turn the hands, see in the middle there, all of a sudden these three little pins stick up. And when they do, there's an underlying spring that gets lifted and allows the alarm train to run. And that's how most of these alarm watches are made. Those three pins are slightly offset. We'll see that in a bit more detail later. Now it has been a long time since this watch was serviced. There were some inscriptions in the caseback, but I cannot really tell exactly when they're from. But the cannon pinion is pretty much stuck. So in the end I have to resort to using a cutting tweezer to get it off. And this is kind of brutal, so... Ooh, ow. Nothing that a little brute force cannot solve. That said, I have to be very, very careful. If your cannon pinion is that stuck, you need to lift straight up, otherwise you're gonna probably bend or break something. So this watch has two separate trains. So what we're doing now is we're taking off the alarm train, and then we're going to take off the normal train afterwards. So these couple of pieces here are actually to stop the alarm when you pull out the crown. It is a really neat construction, I must say. Of course, LeCoultre was not the first to introduce an alarm watch, but the Memovox is probably the most famous alarm watch. The Memovox was introduced in 1950, and this one from 1952 uses the same movement, the first movement LeCoultre made with the alarm function, the 489. And while we're saying that, we also see a hair. And this one was then made for the US market, as we saw from the case back. And due to the tariff system, the brand was only called LeCoultre in the US until the 1980s actually. And back then this watch would have set you back some $100. Also interesting, if we look at this old ad, is that it was marketed as part of Vacheron Constantin LeCoultre, a division of Longines Wittnauer. And there's this myth going around that this watch was made by Longines due to that kind of marketing, if you will. But those names in the US were distributor names, not manufacturer names. So this watch was a fully standard LeCoultre watch. It's just that they had to manufacture the movement in Switzerland and then case it in the US because of the tariffs. Very weird tariff system in the US, but that's just how it is. Anyway, we took apart most of the dial side stuff. The alarm works, keyless works. What we didn't disassemble yet is the two bridges. There are no winding works or anything on top of the bridges, it's all underneath. So we're going to have to disassemble those as well. A couple of these parts were pretty stuck, like this crown wheel here. So yeah, it's been a while. There are these shims under each of these wheels, so we have to put them back in the right order. Otherwise they're not going to run smoothly. The click springs are also kind of psycho style, if you will. Alright, let's also take the mainsprings out of the barrels. Two barrels, of course, one for the alarm and one for the movement. The way this movement is constructed, you have very long barrel arbor pivots. So they can be a little bit tricky to get out as well. So for the alarm barrel, which we're working on here, I actually decided to take the mainspring out of the barrel and then take the barrel arbor out of the mainspring eye. And then we do the same thing with the movement barrel. And the movement barrel is not in the greatest condition. There is some dirt there that has really set for probably decades. So we're gonna run it through the cleaner and then see what happens, what we have to do with the barrel. Right, last thing we're gonna do is to peg the jewel holes, get out any crud or dirt that's stuck there. And then we're also gonna clean the pivots of the wheels a little bit. So it does take quite a few parts to build an alarm movement like this. So let's get all of them into our basket and then into the cleaning machine. Alright, with the movement on a slow boil, let's look at the case. So the case is 10K gold filled. And it is in good condition, so we're not going to polish it in any way. We are going to clean it. So let's get it into the ultrasonic. If you like going to the dentist, you're going to love this sound. So most watches from the early 50s did not have shock settings, and that's also the case with this watch. And one consequence of that is that to clean the balance jewels, we have to first take the balance off, and then we have to disassemble the cock. And there are some itsy bitsy tiny polka dot bikini screws on this balance cock. I'm using my 0.6 millimeter screwdriver on them. So 0.6 millimeter if you're using the British Imperial system. So if you're part of the British Empire still, then that would be about 1/43 of an inch, I suppose. And after cleaning these jewels a little bit extra, we're gonna put them into this Epilam solution. The product name is Fixo Drop, and what it does is it leaves a very thin film on the surface of the jewels, and that then allows the oil and the lubrication to stay in place and not creep. The thing with this Epilam is that it evaporates faster than a kid's life savings in a candy store. So that's why we have to use this special bottle. It's kind of hourglass shaped, but what it does is that it leaves a very small surface for the liquid to evaporate from. And with that we can then put a tiny little bubble of thin oil into the center of the cap jewel. And then reassemble the balance cock. And yeah, these are small screws, small parts. So unless you really like working on things you can pretty much not see, then don't try this at home. When we're putting the balance on, we need to put the stud into the stud hole on top there with a screw. There. We also need to fit this very tiny and fragile hairspring in between the index pin and the boot of the index, which we're then turning over here to hold the hairspring in place. And then when screwing the balance down onto the main plate again, I'm not having spasms here. I'm trying to rotate the main plate a little bit to see that the balance oscillates, so we don't break a pivot. And then we put a little bit of oil on the capstone on the dial side as well. And then we can check if the balance oscillates really. And that looks all right for now. Let's then proceed with the barrels. We put a little bit of grease at the bottom of the barrel so that the mainspring winds and unwinds a bit more smoothly. And I've said it before and I'll say it again. Watchmakers are tool junkies. But this tool is pretty much invaluable when you do a lot of watch repair. It's a mainspring winder that comes in sets with different sizes. And it allows us to get the mainspring back into the barrel without much risk of damaging it. Doing it by hand is of course possible, but it does incur a bit more risk of bending or otherwise kinking the mainspring. There we go. Then we can put that into the barrel. This barrel arbor in the middle here is what connects through a couple of wheels to the crown. So that when you turn the crown, it starts coiling the mainspring. And that's what provides power, of course, to a mechanical watch. Might remember it was a little bit tricky to get out, but we managed to get it back in relatively easily. And then we just need to lubricate the friction points, and then we're good to go. With the alarm barrel ready, we just basically do the same thing with the movement barrel. You might remember that this one was very dirty and some grime had really set in there, so I used very fine sandpaper to take that out. That's why you can see this slight yellow tinge there. That's from the brass of the barrel coming through the plating. So these mainsprings have a T end shape, or T-shape end, I suppose, which is a little bit tricky. But my middle name is actually Tricky. Yeah, but you didn't know that, huh? And not only that, my last name is apparently Idiot. Because the other day we were out driving and it was a 50 zone. And I was going 52. And the reason I was going 52, because on the radio there was an old Judas Priest song going, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law, breaking the law. So I turned to my wife and said, yeah, thug life. And she just rolled her eyes and said, you're an idiot. Of course the kids giggled and thought it was fun, but kind of hurt deep down inside. Speaking of the kids, my almost 7-year-old daughter, she's, for some reason, and I think she must have that from her mother, she's kind of a farting machine. She farts like a Bulgarian bean farmer after a rough night out drinking lukewarm beer. And I just don't get it. I mean, she's this sweet little innocent girl and just, especially in confined areas like a car or my workshop. So on that same ride, I turned to my wife and I said, the devil is in the child. Yeah, she rolled her eyes, said I'm an idiot, which I kind of accept by now. Anyway, we started rebuilding the train. But to complete that, we need to also reassemble the bridge. And these shims, again, need to make sure they're in the right spot. And then we put a tiny bit of oil on the different pivot points. We're using quite thick oil for this. And that's because these are parts with high torque and low speed in rotation. For the wheels that rotate fast, like the escape wheel or the fourth wheel, you use thinner oil. But for slowly rotating parts with a lot of torque, we use thicker oil. Last thing we need to do then is to put in the click spring. And then we're done with the alarm bridge. And then we can do the same thing basically with the train bridge. So yeah, life as a watchmaker is just as glamorous as I always thought it would be. I mean, you get to spend all your earnings on new tools that you'll probably never use. You get to sit completely still most of the day and yeah. Honestly though, it's fantastic work. You really get in the zone when you're working on these tiny little machines. There's of course an instant reward whenever you fix a problem, repair something, make it look better. Definitely beats Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoints. So with the movement train in place, we're going to immediately start on the alarm train. Normally I would do the movement train first, put in the keyless works and check that everything runs properly. But we already know that the alarm train works as it should. So unless I screwed something up, which I might have, it's going to work fine this time as well. And also given that the alarm works and the keyless works are kind of intertwined, it's just easier to do everything in one go. Had there been issues with the watch, it would be better to assemble them separately. It would take a little bit more time, but then you can more easily isolate the issues. So we're putting in these setting lever screws before we put the alarm bridge on. The alarm bridge has seen some battle, it seems. Cosmetically not too great. There isn't really a whole lot to do about that. We could try to source a new bridge, but parts for these old movements are getting very expensive. And refinishing it is not really an option. And with both bridges in place, we can then turn our attention to the dial side. First thing we're going to do is to put on the cannon pinion. We're using this high pressure grease for the cannon pinion, which we also use for a lot of the parts in the keyless works. So we see that same beautiful blue color on the sliding pinion here and also on the winding pinion. And yes, in case you're wondering, LeCoultre worked clever enough to make these parts identical. So it's not like one of these sliding pinions or one of the winding pinions is slightly different than the other. And that also then goes for the stems, of course. As I mentioned, this was the first movement, the 489. Obviously, the successor to the 489 was the 814. Yeah, I have no idea how they get to that. Kind of like one of the big mysteries of life, I suppose. A little bit akin to why Windows 7 was called 7 when it was clearly not the 7th. Anyway, they came out with the 814, which was very similar with some improvements, and then they came up with the automatic version of it just a few years later. On the dial side, the alarm works are very similar. And it's a fun watch to work on. Even more fun, of course, is to wear it. The expression on people's faces when the alarm goes off is just too funny. The Memovox is not as loud as the Cricket, the Vulcan alarm watch. That was the first alarm watch. But it's loud enough. Of course, it does vibrate on your wrist as well because of the hammer going back and forth. In terms of usefulness, they actually made the special parking versions of the Memovox back in the day, so that you could set your alarm to avoid getting ticketed, obviously. Nowadays, what you would do, of course, is to set the alarm so that when your wristwatch alarm goes off, you can go to your parking app and renew the parking. So, still pretty useful. But that's kind of how the world is now. Technology-wise, mechanical watches are outdated for sure, but they are still very alluring, very fascinating to us. And creating an alarm inside the wristwatch is just very, very cool, I must say. And of course, we're not really buying watches to tell us time anymore. We're buying them because of the admiration we have for these tiny little machines and the skills and the craftsmanship that goes into making them. So these couple of springs we're putting in now is really what makes the alarm go off when we turn the hands, or when the hands turn by themselves. We'll see that in a second. Let's just finish the keyless works with a setting lever spring, and also this little extra plate that works as kind of a yoke spring. Neat construction. So the Memovox is still in production. You actually still have the parking version of it as well, which is kind of cool and a little bit 1960s vibe to it. They also make diving versions of it, which then vibrates a bit more on the arm, I believe. Otherwise it's kind of difficult to hear an alarm ringing under the sea. The more recent versions also went the kind of gong way, so a bit more of a chime rather than just this rattle from this movement. In a sense, kind of using the psychobelmatic idea. One interesting aspect of LeCoultre is that it of course has a great reputation also in the industry, being sometimes called the watchmaker's watchmaker. And the reason for that moniker is really that they made movements for a lot of other high-grade manufacturers. So you would find IWC watches with LeCoultre movements, for instance. And LeCoultre has always been known for complications. Interestingly, not chronographs. They never had an in-house chronograph until a couple of decades back. Alright, we managed to get pretty much everything together. So we're gonna lubricate the pallet fork. And due to the construction of this one, we actually lubricate the entry pallet instead of the exit as we normally do. Procedure is the same though. Put a tiny little bead of oil on the pallet and then rotate the pallet back and forth. And that way we distribute the oil to the escape wheel teeth. Alright, let's get the balance in and see if the watch starts running. Moment of truth. Yeah, that was easy. But is it running well? That's the question. Let's first lubricate the remaining jewel holes. And then we can demagnetize the movement and put it on a time grapher. So at first we see the watch runs way too fast, which is not uncommon after having disassembled the cock. But it's a little bit more disturbing that after we adjust the time, we see that the pattern is quite irregular. All of a sudden it spikes. And that's an indication that the hairspring coils are touching. And if we look a little bit closer at how the hairspring develops, that seems to be the problem. As we can see on the right side of the hairspring there. So we're going to gently adjust it. We can do that with the balance in situ, just by gently pressing on it with the tweezers. And then another issue that we saw initially was that the difference in timekeeping in different positions was way too big. And that's typically caused by this big gap between the pin and the boot here. That gap should be as small as possible while still letting the hairspring breathe. So we'll see if that does the trick. The major cause of this asymmetrical development of the hairspring is, however, that it's not centered on the balance staff. So if we take the hairspring off the balance and then place it on the cock, the center of the hairspring should cover the center of the jewel hole. And if it does, then you're generally golden. Unless, of course, the hairspring is not symmetrical in the coils. But this actually looks good. So yeah, we're going to just put it back on the balance and then proceed. The way we put it back on the balance is by using our staking tool. Yeah, another tool. But this one we actually do use quite a lot, so kind of good value, I suppose. The staking tool has a lot of different sized holes. So we find the hole that best fits our balance. Then we center that hole. And then we put the hairspring back on top of the balance staff and press it down. Alright. Then we put the balance back on the cock. Put the stud into the stud hole, screw it in. And we twist the boot over the hairspring. So you sometimes have to do this a few times, and that's of course creating a little bit extra work. But with the balance in place again, let's look at the time grapher now. So when we put the hairspring back on the balance, we also tried to adjust the beat error at the same time, and we got it reduced a little bit, so we're going to be happy with this. Alright, time to put the dials back on. Pretty much double of everything with this watch. So this inner dial rotates when you use the alarm crown, so that you can set the alarm to the time you want. To put on the hands, we first find where the alarm starts. There. And then we place the hour hand at that time. And don't worry about the alignment, we will make it right. Then we'll just check that the alarm goes off when the hour hand comes just on the indication there. Yeah. And then we can put the hour hand to 12 and then proceed as normal. One thing I didn't mention is that the first versions of the Memovox weren't actually marked Memovox. They just had this wrist alarm indication. But there we see that the hands work as they should. So then we can also put on the second hand. And then we're almost ready to case the movement. There is one thing we're gonna change with the case, and that is the crystal. It was a bit beat up, so we're gonna just put in a new one. For that, we're gonna use this very simple crystal lift. Also a very useful tool. What we have to be careful with here is that we don't slip, first of all. So that we hold the crystal tight and then make sure it's small enough to fit inside that little groove in the bezel or in the case. And then we gently release the pressure so that it expands into that groove. And then we can put the case on top of the movement. I'm going to put a little bit of silicone on the crown tubes so that the crown rotates a little bit smoother. And no, these are not the original crowns. No, you're right, dog. I would bark at that also. They're not the original. Of course, the giveaway is that they're not even identical. What is not a giveaway is that they're not signed, because the initial crowns were not signed. But I will have to try to find another pair of crowns before selling this watch. That is a beautiful watch though, with that tuxedo dial, and very nice case, I think. Yeah, it is nice, doggy. Alright, with a new case back gasket, let's have a look at the case back also. I said I wasn't going to do anything with the case. I am, however, going to reapply the brushing a little bit on the case back, so it looks brushed and not half shiny like it did before. We're not going to take all the scratches out, but at least it's a little bit improvement. So there we go. Then with the locking ring, we're going to use the same tool to screw the locking ring back on as well. And there we are. With the new strap on, let's just check that everything works. That we can set the alarm. Before seeing the watch on the wrist, I'd just like to remind everyone that at vintagewatchservices.eu you can always find more than 100 beautiful vintage watches. YouTube subscribers get 10% off. Just ask us for the coupon code. Yeah, it rings quite long, that alarm. Hope you liked this video. If you did, then clicking like and subscribe will really help the channel. We'll be back with another video shortly. Until then, ta-ta.